can't tell you how much I sympathize with the way everybody has had to endure this unbelievably testing and challenging time. And I know that so many people have...
70 years of standing one step behind, of swallowing his opinions, of bowing to protocol when every instinct told him otherwise, of wearing the uniform, attending the dinners, reading the speeches, and never, not once, breaking publicly with the institution he had given his entire adult life to protect. 70 years of perfect, silent discipline. And then his son came to him and said he wanted to marry Camilla Parker Bowles. And Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, the man who had never broken publicly with the protocols of the crown, planted something. Not a complaint, not a confrontation, not a dramatic speech that would later show up in a biography. Something quieter, something more durable, something so precisely constructed that it would outlast him by years, shape the terms of Camilla's entry into the royal family, and define the cost of the door Charles walked her through. By the time you finish watching this video, you will understand that what Philip did was not an act of grief or rage or stubbornness. It was architecture. And the most brutal part? Charles couldn't stop it. Nobody could. Stay with me, because this story goes much deeper than the empty chair. The man before the moment. Before we talk about what Philip did, we have to understand who Philip was. Because if you don't understand the man, you will misread every single decision he made. Philip was not a man who did confrontation. That is the foundational thing. He did not pull people into rooms for difficult conversations. He did not deliver speeches about duty and consequence. He did not write letters that got leaked to biographers. That was not his register. His register was presence and absence, attendance and non-attendance. And for a man operating at his level, inside an institution built entirely on the semiotics of who stands where, who sits next to whom, who shows up and who stays away, those signals were not subtle. They were the loudest language available. Think about what it actually means to be Prince Philip inside the British royal family for 7 decades. You are not the monarch. You will never be the monarch. Your entire role is to support, to appear, to stand slightly behind, to never overshadow, and to do all of this with absolute consistency regardless of your personal feelings about any of it. He did that. For 70 years, he did exactly that. He converted from the Greek Orthodox Church to Anglicanism to marry Elizabeth, the institutional requirement, met without public complaint. He gave up his naval career, a career he was exceptional at, a career that was genuinely his, to become the consort, the institutional requirement, met. He adopted the name Windsor instead of Mountbatten for the dynasty. The institutional requirement, met. Every private preference, every personal ambition, every individual desire, subordinated, packaged, filed away. And he did it because he believed, genuinely, completely, that the institution mattered more than any individual inside it. Now, hold that. Hold the image of a man who spent 70 years subordinating everything personal to everything institutional. And then ask yourself, when a man like that finally says no, when a man with that level of discipline, that level of institutional loyalty, that depth of personal sacrifice finally draws a line, what does that no actually mean? It doesn't mean he lost his temper. It doesn't mean he was being difficult. It means he reached a conclusion, a considered, sustained, irreversible conclusion, and he communicated it the only way he knew how to communicate anything that mattered, through what he did and did not do. He also retained something else that becomes essential to understanding April 9, 2005. Philip was born and raised in the Greek Orthodox Church. His conversion to Anglicanism was administrative, the institutional requirement of marrying Elizabeth. But in 2011, he stated explicitly that inwardly, he had remained Orthodox. The conversion was a piece of paperwork. The framework was not. The Eastern Orthodox view of marriage is not flexible. The sacrament is considered indissoluble. Remarriage is treated as penitential rather than celebratory. Received, not blessed in the full sacramental sense. This is not a technicality. This is a theological conviction held by a man who had spent 70 years fulfilling every institutional requirement placed on him. Charles had been married. The marriage had collapsed in documented, public, catastrophic fashion. And now Charles wanted to make the woman at the center of that catastrophe his wife. Philip reached a verdict through his faith, through his institutional logic, and through his decades of watching what the crown could and could not survive. He delivered it through absence. The wound that wouldn't close. To understand Philip's verdict on Camilla, you have to understand what Diana represented to him. And this is where the story gets genuinely painful. Philip did not oppose Camilla because she was personally unsuitable. He was not operating from simple dislike. He was operating from institutional damage assessment. And what he assessed was catastrophic. Diana was not just Charles's ex-wife. Diana was a global phenomenon, the most photographed woman on earth, beloved in a way the royal family had never quite seen before. And the collapse of the Wales marriage played out in documented, public, devastating fashion, with affairs on both sides confirmed, with the panorama interview, with the formal separation, with the divorce. That collapse did not just damage Charles, it damaged the crown. And Philip, the man who had given everything to protect the crown, watched it happen. He watched his son's marriage become the most public institutional failure in the history of the modern British monarchy. He watched Diana become a martyr. He watched the polls. He watched the people outside Kensington Palace after her death in 1997, and understood with perfect clarity exactly what the institution was dealing with. Robert Lacey, in Battle of Brothers, one of the most rigorously sourced accounts of the Windsor family dynamics during this period, documents palace aides describing Philip and Charles as men with fundamentally different views on what the crown could tolerate. That difference was not abstract. It was visceral. It was rooted in decades of Philip watching Charles make choices that Philip believed endangered the institution both men had dedicated their lives to. Penny Junor's account in The Duchess adds a crucial dimension. The Queen's objection to Camilla was not personal. It was institutional, rooted in the damage the affair had done to the crown. And both the Queen and Philip initially wanted Camilla removed from Charles's life entirely. Not accommodated, not managed, removed. That was where they started. Christopher Anderson in The King adds the relational cost. Philip's parenting style, demanding, exacting, described by Anderson as at times overbearing, had already created a gulf between father and son long before Camilla entered the picture. But the Camilla years, the affair, the failed marriage, the Diana years, widened that gulf into something neither man could bridge. Charles felt his father's verdict not just institutionally, but personally. That weight sat across their relationship for decades. And now Charles was coming back. After everything, after Diana, after the affair, after the divorce, after the public catastrophe Philip had spent years trying to contain, coming back and saying, "I want to marry her." Philip reached his conclusion, not in anger, not in haste. Across years of watching, of weighing, of institutional reasoning, he had spent 70 years getting to this moment, and he communicated his verdict the only way he had ever communicated anything that truly mattered, through the precise management of where he was and was not prepared to be. Before I go further, drop this in the comments right now. Do you think Philip's opposition to Camilla was about protecting the institution or protecting his own legacy? Because those are not the same thing. And the answer changes how you read every decision he made. The Architecture of the Empty Chair, April 9, 2005. Windsor Guildhall Registry Office, 28 guests, no cameras inside the room, a civil ceremony, a registrar, a document, 2 signatures, and then, legally, irrevocably, Charles and Camilla were married. Philip was not there. Let that land properly. Not Philip skipped the reception. Not Philip left early. Philip was not in the room where his eldest son, the heir to the throne of England, signed the legal document that made his marriage real. And here is the thing you need to understand about why this was not just a personal absence, but an institutional statement of staggering precision. Philip had attended everything. For 70 years, he had attended everything. State dinners, foreign visits, Commonwealth tours, ceremonies for institutions he had no personal connection to, ribbon cuttings, award presentations, agricultural shows. He had stood at attention and smiled and shaken hands and done the work with absolute consistency because that was what the role required. This man looked at his son's wedding and said no, not with a speech, not with a letter, with an empty chair, in a specific room, on a specific morning, at the most significant legal act of Charles's personal life. Some people reach for the easy explanation immediately. He was 83, elderly, a long day. Perhaps he simply wasn't well enough for both the morning civil ceremony and the afternoon blessing at St. George's Chapel. I need to address this directly, because it is the argument designed to make Philip's absence seem accidental, to drain it of meaning, to turn a deliberate statement into a logistical oversight. Philip attended the blessing that same afternoon, same day, same body. If his health precluded the Windsor Guildhall at 9 in the morning, it precluded St. George's Chapel at 2 in the afternoon. He was present for the longer, more ceremonially demanding event later in the day. He chose the Windsor Guildhall specifically. He chose to be somewhere else for the civil ceremony, the legal act, and somewhere present for the religious blessing. That choice is the statement. That choice is the weapon. Now here is what tends to get buried in the coverage. Philip was not alone. Queen Elizabeth II was also not at the Windsor Guildhall on the morning of April 9, 2005. The civil ceremony, 28 guests, the legal register, the moment the marriage became binding under the law of the United Kingdom, took place without the monarch in the room. The official explanation centered on her constitutional position as Supreme Governor of the Church of England. A civil registry office was not the appropriate setting for the head of that institution. The logic was sound. The optics were deliberate. But here is what that explanation does not cover. Philip had no such constitutional constraint. He was the Duke of Edinburgh, the Prince Consort, the father of the groom. There was no constitutional reason he could not walk into that room, sit in that chair, and watch his son get married. He simply didn't. Two people, the same morning, the same empty chairs. And as Robert Lacey is precise in documenting, no coordination between them was necessary. They had spent 57 years inside the same institution, reading the same signals, absorbing the same framework. They did not need to discuss it. They arrived, independently through different reasoning, at the same conclusion about what that room required of them. This was not a conspiracy. It was the self-evidence of institutional logic. Both of them knew what the registry meant. Both of them chose accordingly. Here is the question this whole story turns on, and I want your honest answer in the comments. Was Philip's empty chair an act of principle? A man drawing a line that somebody, somewhere, needed to draw? Or was it an act of punishment, aimed not at the crown, but at Charles personally, for choices Philip had spent 30 years refusing to forgive? I genuinely don't know the clean answer. I don't think Philip did either. The precision of the partial yes. Philip refused the registry. He kept his chair empty for the legal act of the marriage. He had made his statement. He had communicated, through the one mechanism that could not be ignored, retracted, or managed by a palace press office, that he withheld his presence from the moment Charles and Camilla became legally husband and wife. And then he walked into St. George's Chapel. 800 guests, the cameras, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the full ceremonial apparatus of a public religious service, hymns, readings, the weight of the Church of England's ancient framework arranged around a blessing for a union it could not formally endorse because Charles had been divorced and the Church's theological position on the indissolubility of marriage had not changed, but could formally receive. And inside that service, something Philip could not have designed more precisely if he had written the order of service himself. Charles and Camilla standing before the congregation, before 800 witnesses and a live television audience, reading aloud from the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, confessing their manifold sins and wickedness, asking in the formal language of the Church, in front of everyone who had come to celebrate, for forgiveness. Think about what Philip was watching. He was watching his son publicly confess, in the formal, liturgical, documented language of the institution Philip had served for 70 years, to what everyone in that building already knew: the affair, the damage, the choice that had broken a marriage and wounded a crown. And Philip was in his seat, watching every word of it. The no had not become a yes. It had become something more considered than either. He attended the event where the institution's conditions were met. He stayed away from the one where they weren't. That distinction, held by an 83-year-old man across a single afternoon, executed with surgical precision on the most emotionally charged day of his son's adult life, is the most precise thing Philip ever communicated about what he was and was not prepared to accept. Robert Lacey records this not as drama, but as deliberateness. A man who spent a lifetime ensuring his actions meant exactly what he intended them to mean. Some people look at Philip's presence at the blessing and say, "Doesn't that constitute endorsement? Doesn't showing up undermine everything the empty chair communicated?" No. And here is why. Refusing the blessing entirely would have been the simpler no, the cruder statement. Philip did not take it. He chose the more precise option, presence in the room that met his conditions, on his terms. On the same afternoon, he had already made his position unmistakably clear. The man who refused the registry could have refused the chapel too, because the chapel was where the institution's own conditions were being fulfilled, where Charles and Camilla were standing in public penitence before the church's framework, not celebrating outside it. Philip sat in that chapel and watched the door open. He had not unlocked it. He had defined, with more precision than any public statement could have managed, exactly how far his acceptance went. That is the architecture, the blessing and not the registry, the conditional yes and the deliberate no, both on the same afternoon, both communicating the same thing from slightly different angles. He built the door Camilla would walk through, and he made sure everyone, Charles, Camilla, the institution, the public, understood what the door was built on. The Queen's weapon, the paperwork. Philip communicated through absence. Elizabeth communicated through documentation, and together, those two instruments formed the most precise institutional verdict on Camilla that the royal family ever delivered. February 10th, 2005. Clarence House made an announcement, one that received considerably less attention than it deserved. Camilla Parker Bowles, upon marrying the Prince of Wales, would not be known as the Princess of Wales. She would be the Duchess of Cornwall, and when Charles eventually acceded to the throne, the official position was that she would be styled Princess Consort, not Queen. This requires careful unpacking, because the legal reality is more complicated than the announcement suggested. The government confirmed it explicitly. The marriage was not morganatic. Under common law, Camilla would legally become queen upon Charles's accession. There was no legal basis for restricting her title. The restriction was not a constitutional requirement. It was a choice, a deliberate institutional decision made at the highest level to define the terms under which Camilla entered the family, and the limits of what that entry was allowed to mean. The title that would have placed Camilla at the same formal level as the woman whose marriage to Charles had collapsed in such catastrophic public fashion, Queen, was being publicly preempted through a voluntary restriction that the institution imposed on itself. The instrument of consent, the formal document through which Queen Elizabeth II gave her approval for the marriage under the Royal Marriages Act 1772, carried those conditions within its institutional framework. Not just a blessing, a bounded blessing, a yes with walls built around it. Philip had his empty chair. The Queen had her paperwork, different instruments, the same verdict. And that verdict was structural. It shaped Camilla's institutional position for the next 17 years. Every time she was introduced, every time she appeared on official documentation, every time a journalist noted her title, the absence of Princess of Wales, the designation of Duchess, the promise of Princess Consort, the architecture Philip and Elizabeth had built in 2005 was quietly, persistently, structurally present. This is what it means to plant a weapon that outlasts you. Not a dramatic gesture, not a public confrontation, a title restriction embedded in a legal document, a condition attached to an instrument of consent, a framework that continues to communicate, continues to define, continues to cost, long after the people who built it have moved on. For 17 years it held. What it cost Charles. We need to talk about what Philip's weapon actually cost, not Camilla, Charles. Because the most brutal element of this story is not what Philip did to Camilla, it is what the architecture forced Charles to do to himself. Charles wanted a cathedral wedding, the full institutional weight of a royal ceremony, Westminster Abbey or St. Paul's, the Archbishop of Canterbury presiding over the full sacramental celebration, the kind of wedding that communicates to the institution and to the watching world that the heir to the throne is marrying in the full dignity of his position. What he got was a civil ceremony in a town hall outside the castle walls. No ceremonial architecture, no institutional endorsement, the legal minimum. He redesigned his own wedding. The heir to the throne of England restructured the most significant personal event of his adult life, scaled it down, stripped it of ceremony, moved it out of Windsor Castle entirely, because his father would not come to the version he actually wanted. Think about what that means as a human being, stripped of all the institutional analysis. Your father will not attend your wedding unless you agree to hold it in a form he considers acceptable. And the form he considers acceptable, the blessing, not the registry, the penitential framework of the 1662 prayer book, the public confession of sins, is the form that most clearly communicates that your marriage is being received under conditions rather than celebrated unconditionally. And Charles accepted the terms. He redesigned the wedding. He received the conditional blessing instead of the full celebration. He did all of this because the alternative, a cathedral wedding without his father in attendance, was a statement he was not willing to make. That is the weight Philip's verdict carried. Heavy enough that Charles restructured his entire wedding rather than proceed without his father's partial endorsement. Christopher Anderson's account in The King is unflinching on the relational damage. Philip's demands were not made in cruelty, or at least, they were not experienced by Philip as cruel. They were the requirements of the institution as he understood them. But Charles experienced them personally. He felt his father's verdict not just as an institutional position, but as a judgment of his worth as a son, as a man, as someone who had made choices that his father found unacceptable. That weight does not lift. It sat across their relationship for decades. And on April 9th, 2005, it sat across the most important morning of Charles's personal life, in the form of an empty chair at a registry office. Philip set the price of the door. Charles paid it. Here is something I want you to genuinely sit with, and then drop your answer in the comments. Did Philip's refusal make Charles a better king? Did the cost, the humiliation, the redesigned wedding, the conditional blessing, produce in Charles a more serious, more disciplined understanding of what the crown requires? Or did it simply wound him in ways that had no institutional benefit at all? Those are two completely different legacies. And the answer matters. The weapon's lifespan. Philip died on April 9th, 2021, 16 years to the day after he stood in St. George's Chapel and watched his son's second marriage receive the church's conditional blessing. The date is not a metaphor. It is simply a fact. The kind of fact that arrives without commentary and requires none. But here is what happened to the weapon he built after he was gone. For 17 years, the title restriction held. Duchess of Cornwall, Princess Consort. The framework Queen Elizabeth II had embedded in the Instrument of Consent in 2005. Every year that passed without the restriction being lifted was another year the architecture of Philip's verdict remained structurally present in the institution. And then, in February 2022, in her Platinum Jubilee message, Queen Elizabeth II publicly expressed her wish that Camilla should be known as Queen Consort when Charles acceded to the throne. The Princess Consort designation, the promise made to the public in 2005, was withdrawn by the one person who had the authority to withdraw it. The Queen had held the line for 17 years, and then she let it go. Philip was not there to see it. He had been gone for 10 months. Camilla is queen. That part is settled. The coronation happened. The title came. The institution that spent decades holding the line eventually moved it. And here is where the story reaches its most uncomfortable conclusion. Philip did not lose. The reading that Camilla becoming queen represents Philip's defeat, that everything he stood for, every empty chair, every withheld endorsement, every precisely calibrated absence ultimately amounted to nothing, misreads what Philip was actually doing. He was never trying to prevent the outcome. He was never under the illusion that he could stop Charles from marrying Camilla. The Queen had given her formal consent at the Privy Council on March 2nd, 2005. The legal machinery was already in motion. He made his statement through the empty chair, and then he pivoted to the only thing that remained available to him. He tried to define the cost. For 17 years, through the title restriction, the princess consort designation, the conditions attached to the instrument of consent, the blessing instead of the registry, that cost was real. It was structural. It was built into the institutional architecture that defined Camilla's position for the entirety of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. Camilla waited, not in the relationship. She had been in the relationship for decades. She waited in the family, accepted but not sanctioned, present but not fully endorsed, in the building but denied the keys to the room Philip had decided she should not have access to. He shaped the door she walked through. He did not lock it. Those are different things. And the man who spent 70 years communicating through precisely calibrated presence and absence understood that distinction better than anyone watching from outside. The silence was not failure. The silence was the instrument, and it held for exactly as long as the hand that built it was still in the room. The human truth. There is something inside this institutional story that only becomes visible when you step back from the protocol and the paperwork and the empty chairs. Philip could not choose for Charles. No parent can. The man who had spent 70 years inside the most protocol-bound institution on earth, who had subordinated his own name, his own career, his own ambitions to the requirements of a role that was never formally his, could not make his son do the thing he believed the crown required. He tried, in the only ways available to him, through the cold atmosphere he maintained around Camilla for 30 years, through the warmth withheld, through the weight of his disapproval in every room she entered before she had formally joined the family, through the empty chair, through the conditions, through the architecture. He tried, and he could not change the outcome. Charles had decided. The decision was made long before April 2005, long before the Privy Council consent, long before the civil ceremony in the town hall. Charles had decided across decades that Camilla was the person he was going to be with, and Philip, for all his institutional power, for all his precision, for all his 70 years of accumulated authority, could not undo that decision. So he chose the only thing a parent in that position can actually choose, not the outcome, the cost, the blessing, and not the registry. The title that Camilla would not carry, the conditions attached to the instrument of consent, that nobody in the palace discussed publicly, but everybody inside it understood. He set the price of the door. He could not lock it. He made sure it was not free to open. And the condemned moment, the thing this story keeps circling back to, is what preceded all of it. Charles loved someone, waited decades to marry her. The condemned moment is what happened during the years before that. The choices made during the marriage to Diana, the affair, the documented damage, the catastrophe that placed the entire institution in an impossible position and forced Philip to become the man with the empty chair. Philip's silence was the consequence of what Charles did. The responsibility for that silence belongs partly to the son whose choices made it necessary. That is the human truth. Brutal, unresolvable, not a story about a villain and a hero, but about a father and a son, and an institution that sat between them and demanded things from both of them that neither could fully give. The Final Reckoning, April 9th, 2005. Windsor Guildhall Registry Office, 28 guests, 2 signatures, a document. The marriage, legally, was real. The 2 people whose presence would have meant the most were somewhere else. Not unwell, not unavailable, somewhere else, by choice. Waiting for the part of the day they had each decided, separately, through different reasoning, to attend. The blessing at St. George's Chapel. 800 people, the cameras, the formal weight of the Church of England's ancient language arranged around Charles and Camilla as they read their confession aloud. Philip was in his seat. In the other room, the one with the register, the legal act, the civil record, his chair was empty. That chair is what this entire story was about. Not defiance, not a tantrum, not an elderly man making a logistical decision about a long day. An empty chair in a specific room, held empty by a man who understood exactly what his presence in that room would have communicated, and refused to communicate it. The door Camilla walked through into this family was built on his terms. The blessing, not the registry. The title restriction, the instrument of consent conditions. The architecture of 2005. His fingerprints are on all of it. He did not lose. He defined the cost. And for 17 years, while Queen Elizabeth II held the line on the titles, while Camilla was Duchess and not Princess of Wales and not Queen, for 17 years, the weapon held. Philip died on April 9, 2021, 16 years to the day. The date requires no interpretation. It simply is. A parent cannot choose for their child. The only choice left is what the choice costs. Philip made that choice with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime communicating through what he did not say, did not attend, did not sanction. The weapon he planted was not made of anger. It was made of the same material everything else he built was made of: institutional understanding, accumulated authority, and the absolute, unshakable conviction that presence and absence are the most powerful language available to a man at his level. He used that language one final time on April 9, 2005, and the silence it created held for 17 years, through every title, every official document, every public appearance where the architecture of that morning was quietly, structurally, invisibly present. Camilla is queen now. Charles got, in the end, everything he wanted, but he got it on the other side of a door that his father built, and he paid the price his father set. Philip made sure of it. One final question before you go, and I want this in the comments because I think the answers are going to be genuinely divided. Was Philip right? Not institutionally, not strategically. As a father, was he right? The man who spent 70 years protecting the crown left his son's wedding chair empty. He set the price of the door and watched Charles pay it. He planted an architecture that held for 17 years and then dissolved 10 months after he died. Was it worth it? Drop that in the comments. And if this is the kind of deep dive you come here for, subscribe, because there is so much more of this to get into.